So, joining me today for this podcast by Forensic Focus, I have a very eminent professor from the US, Professor Patrick Brady. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Hi, I am Patrick Brady. I am a professor in criminal justice and criminology at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs in the US, in Colorado.
And in 2017, you released a paper which exclusively looked at the mental health effects of digital forensic investigators. What inspired you to focus on secondary traumatic stress and burnout among child exploitation investigators?
Great question. I mean, I never thought in a million years that I would ever be looking into this topic. A lot of it started in my childhood. My neighbor was kidnapped and she was never found. We were in the same grade, and still to this day, she's never been found. And I just remember the response to the community and how they really emphasize stranger danger and things like that. And I always thought that was a really interesting response. And so I wanted to get better at research to figure out like how do we actually improve outcomes, but also f- the struggle of investigating cases against when the crimes involved are most vulnerable. And so I went to school to study forensics, and while I was going to school, I got a job supervising adolescents who had been adjudicated of felony sex offenses. And so I didn't even really know the full gamut of what they were charged with and convicted of and things like that. And so I worked there for 2 years, and it really just changed my whole perspective on the crimes, but also just society in general. And I started to notice how it was really impacting my thinking, like outside of work, and how I was really looking at things through a different mindset. And so while I was working there, I really enjoyed the job, but I knew it wasn't going to be my future career. But I was fascinated with people that they do this on a regular basis, particularly those who the digital forensic examiners who are exposed to horrific videos, images, sounds, but also the stories of these cases. And so when I went to graduate school at Boise State, I really wanted to explore this idea of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout, and more particularly, how can agencies really support the people that are doing this work so that we can have competent but also healthy investigators who still enjoy what they do, who still feel like they are being successful, feeling like they have the capacity to do this work while still being mom outside of work, while still being dad, having a healthy quality of life both at work and outside of work. I was working on a project with a family justice center, and they where they also conducted forensic interviews of children. And so my focus was on the domestic violence aspect of it. And so I was able to make some connections with forensic interviewers and then also investigators who were investigating internet crimes against children. And so I was able to make some connections and get a survey out, both on a private listserv for internet crimes against children task force members and those who were a certified forensic interviewer that worked for a child advocacy center. And I really wanted to kind of explore, how does this work impact people who are in the room with children as they are disclosing and or not disclosing these horrific things, and also the reasons why they're not disclosing these. One thing that was really interesting is some of the older victims were very keen to this idea of, you know, I don't really want to talk about it because if I did, dad's going to get arrested, and then my mom's not going to be able to afford rent, and so I was interested in how kind of those aspects really impacted the forensic interviewer, but more so I was interested in the investigative aspect of it and those who may not always have direct contact with the children, but were exposed to horrific images. Child sexual abuse materials, the sounds, and with that. And so, more particularly, I was really interested in this work life balance. Like, how do people do this while also maintaining a good quality life outside of work. And so I was really interested in the parental aspect of it, but more so like how do we actually get good measures and how do we actually get sound information? And so I published a study that was looking at secondary traumatic stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue. And I think, like like a lot of researchers, I think if I had what I know now, I would have done the survey a little bit different with some different measures. But I still feel like it really gave us some really interesting information on just some of the correlates that really kind of increase these aspects. And so, secondary traumatic stress and burnout tend to be like the negative aspects of work, where compassion satisfaction is tied to the positive aspects of it. And so we have a very long story short, what I found was really interesting is one of the things I was focusing on is like, does being a parent increase your risk for negative mental health issues? And kind of like at the bivariate level, we did find that, being a parent does increase secondary traumatic stress and burnout. But then when we actually put it into these complex multivariable models, other factors tended to matter more specifically prior trauma. And that was really interesting because I do a lot of work in domestic violence, and one thing that domestic violence shelter managers tell me a lot of the times is that it's great to have people who want to work in this field, but sometimes it's hard because a lot of the people that are drawn to this field have backgrounds in it, and not everyone is always able to cope with their prior trauma in the way that they can maintain a professional role in it. And so one shelter manager is like, well, sometimes I'll have a new advocate and then they're working with a client. And then all of a sudden I have two individuals that are in crisis because whatever this person said had triggered the other one. And I was wondering if that was necessary or true with investigators, because we have to realize that these are people too who also have traumatic backgrounds, whether that was a horrific car wreck to domestic violence to being a victim themselves. And that and across the studies tended to have a stronger impact over a lot of or being a parent. And so that's why we also asked some open-ended questions about how this work has really impacted them as a person, but also outside of work, and then what they want from their agencies. And so the trauma factor was huge. And so I really kind of a lot of the findings center around what are we doing in terms of the onboarding of these individuals and how we are getting them kind of into these units. 10 years ago, a lot of investigators were telling me like I didn't have a choice. Like it was like I drew the short straw. I had to go into this unit. Now I that is not the case. Now we're starting to realize that the negative impacts of this work, like you really have to go into the unit with a specific kind of mindset and things like that. And from what I've heard, it seems like agencies are doing a little bit better of a job onboarding them and getting them ready for this information. But even then, what are we doing for their family members and things like that? And I feel like the family members of these family members and friends, people who work in this field, tend to be overlooked in terms of providing support and resources. When we know across the board what really helps buffer a lot of the negative effects of this work is social support. That is both from colleagues, supervisors, administrators, but also the people outside of work. Whether they are involved in the field or not, they provide, a space outside of work where they can not have to worry about the negative
And
aspects of this. And
decompress,
so
isn't it?
from
Yeah.
and decompress. And so from these studies, I got really interested in looking at stress and burnout in police officers, especially those who were working crimes against children, sexual violence, domestic these cases that are just really heart wrenching and complicated to investigate, and how that really impacted things outside of work. And so I ended up doing my dissertation on burnout among police chiefs to see, okay, well, if this is happening among the front line, what's going on at the top? And what I found among American police chiefs is that they experience a lot of the same stressors. They have some unique stressors because of their role. But a lot of, administrators are really the ones that they can kind of create the work environment that's going to help people thrive. And so understanding the negative aspects of not only the job, but the work environment are really important for administrators to pay attention to. But then also, what are we doing to connect family members and friends of our investigators so that they have a semblance of support outside of work? And because so what I was finding in a lot of the forensic investigators was that, like, just like everyone, like when they get off work, like they want to relax, they want to decompress, they don't want to necessarily think about everything that's going on and stuff. And sometimes that's really hard because family members, they start to pick up on the changes of people that are investigating these cases, and that they both become both physically and emotionally distant. And that was really interesting in that the investigators were telling us, I don't want to come home and I don't want to talk about my day. One, because it's like my day was horrible because of the things that we do. And two, I don't want to burden my family members or traumatize them about this information. At the same time, they become physically distant in that they weren't really hanging out with friends as much. And if they were, they tended to be people that they worked with who did the work that they did. And that made sense because, nobody understands the work we do like those who do it. And so, like, one investigator was like, I have to go to parties that my wife brings me to, and like, I don't like to tell people what I do because it elicits different reactions. And so sometimes it's like you have people that are like really into it and they want to hear everything. And I'm like, I don't want to talk about work right now. Again, confidentiality, trauma. And or two, it's like, they don't like the police, or they think I'm a weirdo because I investigate child sexual abuse material, or they want to tell me about their own story. And it's just like, that's not the vibe, that's not what I'm looking for. And so it seems like it's very hard for them to kind of get away from it. And then even though they're proud of what they do, it, it's a different sense of pride that is not always conveyed easily to others outside of the field. And so that was really interesting. So they just didn't want to go to a lot of the things that their partners were asking them to come to. But even then, a lot of the investigators were saying, like, there's a lot of things that I would normally do that I don't do now. Like, it's hard to go to malls, it's hard to go to parks, it's hard to go to places where kids are playing, because even the sound of a kid screaming, it may be
It's
because they
triggering,
fell or
isn't it?
because they're excited. It is triggering, and it's these things, like, there are these triggers that they can't always predict. And sometimes they'll go to like a kid's birthday party, and one of the kids, like, it like sets them into a zone where they're like, this looks exactly like one of the kids that I was that or cases that we had and stuff. And they start to see some of the victims in like their own children. And then it also starts to impact their intimacy, like, I'm sorry, nothing's going to ruin the mood more than an image of, child sexual abuse material coming in while you're trying to be intimate with a spouse. And so there's so many things outside of work that are so important for us to recuperate and to really get our bodies back to a good state of not hypervigilance. But a lot of times these investigators and officers in general are socialized to be a little bit more hypervigilant and to look at things through a lens that normal people wouldn't look at, because that is how we catch these perpetrators. Sex offenders are very, very manipulative. And so they not only manipulate the child, but their environment. And so what's unfortunate for these investigators is, like, they have to always think worst case scenario kind of thing, because that's likely what's happening. And so while everyone else may think that this individual seems like a great person, he's giving back to the community, the cop is looking at this person. It's like, yeah, but he's a Boy Scout leader. He's also really involved in the youth group. And so there are these things in cases where they investigate that kind of, we call this vicarious trauma, where it shapes it rewires their brains in terms of how they view safety in the world, not
It
only for
changes the
themselves,
view of
but
the
for
world
others.
completely, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that that is a key thing that we really need to ingrain, not only in policing, but those who work in the field in these kind of more high stress types of cases, is that there's no way that this information doesn't change how you perceive the world. And that's why this information is really limited to a certain number of investigators who have the authority to get access and exposure to these things, because it is traumatizing. And when we look at studies and asking officers to rank, what are your top five most frequent stressors, so things that they encounter on a regular basis versus overall stressors are going to be number one is witnessing crimes against children. Granted, those are not the majority of the calls that they go to, but when they do go to them, it is particularly heart-wrenching. And then also it's like officer involved shootings. The more frequent stressors were like family violence, which can also involve child abuse and things like that. And so really, when cases are involving children, especially younger children, it really, and also children who are being abused by people that the child is socialized to believe to love and respect and things like that. And so it really just kind of, anyway, you have to, so as an investigator, you kind of have to look at things through a worst case scenario, and that cannot be healthy. But that might be a better way to pick up on things that the average person would not, that the perpetrator is trying to manipulate, and that weighs a lot on these investigators. And so I was also interested in like, so what are some things that would help you cope with this work, and what are some things that you would like your agency to help you with? And so a lot of what I realized is I did this when I was working on my master's thesis, and so I've since gone on and got my PhD and a lot better at research. And so, like I said, I would use a bunch of different measures now, but even just the coping mechanisms, it's hard because coping is very subjective. And my takeaway is like really how you deal with this work. Like it really should be something that you enjoy, that doesn't always feel like a chore that takes your mind off of work. And so whether that is working out, spending time with your kids, doing things that aren't going to quote unquote, like, I hate using that word trigger, but that's exactly what it is. But it's not the fault of the investigators, because the triggers are um, inherent, right? It's our amygdala, and it's our lower part of our brain really sensing threats before our cognitive part of our brain can really recognize it. And so sometimes there are things that the officer's not even thinking about that just triggers it, and they don't necessarily know why. And so one is, being able to take care of themselves. And when we are talking about the onboarding process, like, what are people who are applying to this unit, like, what is their stress management program? And do they have one? And that should be one of the first questions. And if not, like, what are we doing in the agency? Like, do we have a wellness coordinator? Do we have supervisors that are equipped to help officers understand, like, okay, well, working in this unit, listen, there's pros and cons, but a lot of the cons are really going to mess with you mentally. So like you need to get into a routine where you are taking breaks from work and things like that. And that's taking care of them outside of work. And so that's everything that you could think of, that everyone else does to cope with work. So run activities, eat healthy, and things like that. Well, internally, these investigators can't always control their work environment. They cannot control the workload. They cannot control the content that they are exposed to. And so because it is a necessary evil to have people that are investigating these cases to be proactive and respond in ways that we can protect children and only themselves. A lot of that is really kind of relies on supervisors and administrators. And so what I learned when I was like looking at the research on burnout with police chiefs is, we really need leaders that are focused on the well-being of the people that are doing the work for them. And so they call this like a health-oriented leadership. And so that I personally feel needs to be something that we need to consider in terms of promotion and people going into supervisory roles. Is, what is your strategy for helping others cope with this information? How do you deal with crisis intervention? What are some things that, how are you personally modeling self-care and stress management? What are you doing to kind of improve the work environment? Are you advocating for, maybe some of the advanced softwares that can help with filtering? So I know there's a lot more technologies now, and they're advancing so quickly that I can't even tell you specifics about them. But a lot of like AI programming and things like that are streamlining kind of the caseloads to really narrow down. If you get a whole cache of images, like AI can really identify specific, like nudity, child pornography potentially, and things like that. Granted, we're still working on the reliability of these aspects, but are there ways that we can kind of save time and not have investigators go through all these horrific images and videos and things like that, and really use technology to kind of pinpoint the aspects of an image or a video that are necessary for a search warrant or for the criminal offense and things like that, so officers aren't constantly exposed to the horrificness of this? And so are supervisors advocating for improvements in technology, improvements in software? Um, to what extent are supervisors conveying to administrators what their unit does? And helping them understand that, this isn't just a picture of a kid in a bathtub. Like these this exploitation material is horrific. We now have a ton of research that shows that it is an occupational hazard to be doing this work. But because it is a necessary evil, because it violates crimes, we need healthy, competent people to do this work. And also, the competency aspect is hard too, because technology is continually changing. And
So the
so
training has to
sometimes,
keep up to date with that as well, doesn't it?
yeah, and and the other issue that we have is like, so there's a an article that was looking at job stress and policing, and they were looking at the number of publications over the years, and it really wasn't until 2010 that we started to see so many more publications. And so now, health and wellness of officers, of just officers in general, is now becoming more stronger priority in a lot of agencies. That's mostly focused on the frontline officers, and really some of us have been doing the work with the digital forensic investigators, here and there and stuff like that. But sometimes that's not even being caught on the radar. And so, like, agencies will hire like wellness coordinators and things like that. They will hire, in-house counselors and things, with the idea that these are for everyone. But also, what are we doing to create specialized preventative mechanisms in terms of what they're exposed to, and then how do we work with officers who are struggling with this information. And so I've noticed that a lot more supervisors and commanders are now requiring officers who work in a child abuse unit or digital forensics, to go see a counselor. Like, they don't care if they go there and they don't say anything, but at least like once or twice a year, they have to go see a counselor. And I'm a big proponent of that. And, as much as I don't like to force people to go into therapy, because ultimately, cognitive behavioral therapy, these different types of modalities, a lot of that requires people to be in a space where they're ready to kind of process prior traumas or what's going on and things like that. And so, like, how are we preparing officers to be vulnerable and to talk about, yeah, this information is hard, and I'm struggling with this case, and I might just need a couple days to take some time. But then again, going to the counselors, in especially in the US, across the board, officers are constantly concerned that they're going to get their firearm taken away. And there are certain, so like, if they are having like suicide ideation and things like that, like, legally they could be a threat to themselves or others, even though if they don't think that. And so a lot of officers are very hesitant in what they convey to the, whether it's an in-house psychologist or not. The other thing too is, do we have psychologists working with police officers or available to officers in the community, or non-sworn officers, the digital forensics investigators, that know the information that they are viewing?
Looking
Like,
at.
do they understand what child sexual abuse material is? Like, a lot of social workers, therapists, like, they're really good in understanding trauma, how trauma impacts the brain, how to work with it, but not necessarily the indirect trauma that comes from listening, reading, hearing about these cases, and being regularly exposed to it. And so, even in the 2017 article, like, one of the strongest predictors was that indirect exposure. And so, so what I argued is that it's officers. Generally, it is not the content that really stresses officers out. It's the things that they can't necessarily control. Like, officers are understand, like, yes, I have to respond to car wrecks, yes, I have to respond to domestic violence, I can figure out how to compartmentalize this information and things like that. But it's the indirect exposures where you're constantly hearing about cases from others. It seems like these cases are never ending. You think you've heard everything before, but then all of a sudden, there's a horrific case or a child homicide that really just sticks with these officers. And so it's the idea that they can't get away with it. And that goes back to my argument about the importance of social support outside of work. But the other thing too is, officers are inherently skeptical of the people that they talk to. It's very hard for officers to be vulnerable, both male and female officers, because of the potential ramifications, not only from other officers perceiving them to be like weak or not able to hack it, versus they think that they might be a liability, or that they might get their firearm taken away and then they're not going to have enough staff and all that stuff like that. And so, and the other thing too is, they don't necessarily, as much as a person could be like, listen, we have privilege communications and things like that, like, you don't necessarily know what's going to be shared with internal affairs or administrators. And so it's really really hard. And I think that goes back to, what are we doing from the top down? To what extent do administrators in agencies, are they aware of what a digital forensic investigator does on a regular basis?
Are they aware of what they see?
Yeah. But also, do they know the people that are doing that work? How often are they stopping and talking to them? Because that was one of the things. One study found that because really what drives a lot of stress is the immediate supervisor and the overall administration. And so officers and people that do this work generally are like, if I have a supportive supervisor, I really enjoy my colleagues. Like, you can shovel poop for a job, but if you like the people that you're working with and there you find, successes and things you enjoy about the job, then even sometimes the grueling aspects could be tolerable. But if you have a supervisor that is micromanaging, that is more concerned about budget or how many forensic interviews versus the quality of forensic interviews, how are
Or the number
they?
of jobs going through the department.
Yeah, like if they're so focused on getting out of the unit and moving up, like that impacts the people that are doing this work. And so, what really helps officers is having like supervisors and administrators that advocate for them, that know who they are, that can pick up on when the person may not be coping adequately or the work might be impacting them. And so that's not only police chiefs to the top brass, but also to the criminal investigation supervisors and things like that. Like sometimes that's a lot harder when you work for these larger agencies where it's almost impossible to know everyone. But I personally feel that the special victims units, the vulnerable units, like those are the people that we want to particularly implement strategies that keep them healthy, still enjoy their job, and recognize that their work is valuable and that they're supported in this job.
Yeah, you have
Um,
to supply that correct support, that correct level of support to maintain those investigators' mental health.
Absolutely. And so, and what's cool and what's great now is that because mental health and wellness is becoming much more common focus in agencies, like it's so awesome to go to trainings now and officers say like, yeah, I was talking to my therapist the other day and he was saying this. And so it's cool to see. And these are like, supervisors and police chiefs who are engaging in that health oriented leadership while they're modeling. Like they are modeling vulnerability in a way that is because a lot of times policing tends to be very masculine, but true masculinity is being, having a good emotional IQ and being able to pick up on how you're feeling in the moment. And so like saying like, yes, this stuff, like no one thinks you are weak because this video of a horrific child rape, if anything, we should be more concerned if you weren't impacted by that video kind of thing. And so it's norm. So takeaway: normalizing the idea that this work is hard and that this will change their perception of safety and society, both in work and outside of work, and not only for themselves but for their family members and people that they care about. To that, the supervisors play a huge role in creating an environment where people can enjoy what they do and feel healthy while they do it. And then for individuals, they really, really need to create a work life balance. And so I'm not saying like, don't hang out with other police officers or don't hang out with people that work in the criminal justice field. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's finding ways that you're not constantly talking about work, or if you are, using humor in appropriate ways. Like I love hanging out with police officers because all of them could be stand-up comedians. They have the worst humor, and it is so funny. Like at times, just because like they know how to pick up on the obscurities of society. And so those are things that are important to maintain well-being. Where we start to see the issues is if the victim is a punchline. The victim should never be a punchline. That is an indicator of the secondary traumatic stress. But it's a really tough question because like, we need people to do this work, but this work is horrific. It is so hard. And if we are not providing adequate support and resources necessary, because the other like another small thing is technology, right? So our supervisors advocating for technology that helps reduce what they're being exposed to. Like there's a technique called face first, where you just have the image of the face and everything else is pixelated. And so if you're not needing to look for any specific marks or indicators, things like that, like you don't necessarily have to see penetration or nudity in the child. Like you could just focus on what you need to focus on in that. But even then, like policing, we have a bunch of technology in policing, but none of that technology talks to each other. And this technology is 5 years outdated versus this. And so even when technology gets updated, are we providing the adequate training necessary for officers to use the updates and know the different features and things like that? And so, and working with police, it's like, they want change, but they hate change at the same time. So it's really hard in that sense. And then I think it's also important to create opportunities and for family members to get to know one another, so that if they are struggling with something like so and so, you're maybe not like naming names or whatever, but like my partner seems to be a lot more emotionally distant, like getting support and feedback from other families being like, hey, that's a normal thing, a part of this job, have you tried this, or different things like that, where they can feel support as well. Because that's the thing, was like when somebody becomes a sworn police officer, we have to realize that family becomes a sworn police officer, and so they are part of the police family, and we need to be
Yeah, they
taking care
absolutely
of
are.
them.
Yeah, I
Because,
mean, from my, you've mentioned so much that I want to talk
I know,
about
I'm sorry,
there.
I will just keep talking forever, so you have to interrupt me.
from, from my point of view, I should tell you, I served 30 years in the police force here in the
Wow.
UK, and I spent 14 of those years working as a digital forensic investigator.
Oh, so oh
I
wow.
do 90% of my work was working with child abuse cases, so I got it every day. And you've said a couple of really interesting things there. Firstly, you mentioned the sounds that you hear when you are looking at the videos. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that the general public aren't really aware of, and they don't take into consideration the role of the digital forensic investigator. They have to sit there and listen to hundreds, if not thousands, of children screaming at times, and that, as you quite rightly say, has a massive impact on their mental health. The other thing you
Yeah.
mentioned of real interest to me, because I think it's a hugely under-researched area, is the effect that it has on the families of the digital forensic investigators as well.
Yes.
Because, as your studies pointed out, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, depression, etc., they are all mental health issues that DFIs can become susceptible to. And when they do, that has an impact on the family. The family have to watch that DFI, very sadly, going downhill. It's something I'm actually going to release an article on Forensic Focus about that this month, and it's actually co-written by my wife, and it's her view
That's
watching
amazing.
my watching the effects of working in this profession, and how that affected me, because I just think it's important to share that.
Totally. And that is something that we don't have a lot of research on, is the family members of not only officers but people who do this work. And the vicarious trauma is real, because there are studies that show they interview the officer and then the spouse of the officer, and the officer is like, no, like, I don't think this work impacts me outside of work. I feel like I can cope pretty well. I try to keep them separate from it. And then when you ask the family members and the spouse, are like, oh no, he's completely different now that he's in this unit or as a police officer, and not necessarily in a bad way, but family members are very perceptive, especially if they knew them before they got into policing, or like before they got into certain units and things like that. They notice the change in the behaviors, because these are the people that love and care about you most. They're going to be the ones that pick up on, the burnout and the stress much more than the officer who's actually experiencing it. And so I would love to read that, because I think, and that's so smart. And I would love to do it, more studies where we are getting the side of the family members, especially the children of officers who do this. And I think that's really interesting, because one of the things that I found in when I asked them, like, how has this impacted your relationships with your children? And so among those, like, forensic interviewers would tell us, it was easier when they were younger, because I'd just be like, no, you're not going to do that because I'm dad and dad says so, or I'm mom and mom says so. But when they start to get older and they started to become teenagers, that's when they want to know why. Why can't I go over to so and so's house? Why can't I go over to the sleepover? Why can't I have a smartphone? I collected this data in 2011, so most of them didn't have smartphones, but now it's like every kid has a smartphone, and the main negative aspect of this with the parent aspect is hypervigilance and overprotectiveness. And so the kids kids start to get really frustrated. And then also like when other kids start to know that their parent is a cop, there's like kids that are like, just, like, let's get him drunk, let's let him do drugs and all stuff like that. Like his dad's a cop, all that stuff. And so there's this additional pressure on them that it stresses out the kids. And then sometimes we had a investigator say, I come home after a hard day and like my kids are arguing over the remote. And to me, I'm like, what a dumb thing to argue about. It's like, I just investigated a case where a kid was raped by his dad, and that kid is damaged, forever. And then I come home, and my kids are arguing about something so dumb, and so they're almost taking the stress from the work out on their kids as well, and making them so hypervigilant that it can create kind of negative relationships. Granted, we found a good number of people that found like doing this work actually made them a better parent. It made them much more open with their kids, focusing on developing healthy relationships younger in life. And so when they get to the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, where they don't want anything to do with parents, they still recognize and respect their parents and know that they can go to them about tough things. Because the other aspect that we have to understand is when we think about child sexual abuse materials, a lot of times we are thinking about that 0 to 10, but we aren't always focused on the idea that from 10 to 18, a lot of those perpetrators are their own peers. And so talking to them about healthy relationships and things like that, trying to build that closeness early on. So when teens do the natural kind of separation, they still recognize that they can go to their parent in the time of need. But if they recognize that like dad is very quiet, doesn't want to talk about problems, or mom is really stressed out from work, all this stuff, they don't feel comfortable, going to that. And at the same time, it's like, what are we doing to the officers and investigators that are doing this work? Like how often are we giving them? So what I learned doing this is that officers had experienced everything I was talking about, but they didn't know the words to it. They didn't know what vicarious trauma was. They didn't know secondary traumatic stress. And just like being an alcoholic, like recognizing what's going on is the first step into uh, developing healthier coping mechanisms. And so not only do we need to help the people doing the work recognize these symptoms, but also their family members so that they can be attuned. And so instead of feeling so lost in terms of how to help this person that they love, they have, terms and ideas about what's potentially going on, not necessarily to diagnose them, but to find support. Whether that's, I'm sure there's tons of blogs out there from family members of police officers, forums. Like, I would imagine that there are support groups out there where family members can find more information. Granted, is that information accurate and helpful? Different story kind of thing. And also, how do we go about doing this in a way that officers and family members would be vulnerable enough to share struggles and conflicts? Because going into this, it's like there's bound to be potentially some illegal activity and things like that. That's why it's really hard to do domestic violence studies with police officers and stuff like that, even though domestic violence rates are not higher among police officers than the general public, and either are divorce rates. They're all the same. There's one study that looked all about it. I think it was 1 in 5 officers have involved in a domestic violence. It was about 20% kind of thing. Granted, I'm always concerned that I'm interviewing a cop's kid, and then there's like a disclosure that comes, whether that like it was from the family or another person and stuff like that. Like navigating that. Granted, we know how to kind of deal with those from the research standpoint, but the long story short, what I'm trying to say is like we need this research, but that's a challenging avenue of research to go, especially getting agencies on board with it, because the legal department, they don't love my questions about domestic violence or perpetration, because they may trust me because we have a working relationship, but they never know if there's going to be a headline, oh, X% of these officers engaged in, and
Yeah, they're
that's not
figures
what I'm
they don't
trying to
want
do.
released, aren't they?
No, and I'm really passionate about this in the way that like, listen, I want to hear everything so we can figure out like what's working, what's not working, and stuff like that, while at the same time understanding that this is sensitive information to be asking about. And but what's nice is and maybe you could shed light on this, is like, do you recognize officers that do this work? Do you feel like they are a lot more in tune with their emotions and like recognize that this work is difficult and that it can stress them out, like compared to other officers that might be in like the drug unit or community oriented policing or something along those?
I think they do, but do they know how to handle it? Do they know how to proactively decompress? No, they don't, because there's no teaching around that. There's no training given to them around that.
Yeah. And I think you're so right because sometimes officers are like, yes, or like, how do they know how to cope with it outside of drinking themselves to sleep or using other mind altering substances and stuff like that, because that obviously makes it a whole lot worse, and things like that. And so we are starting to see a lot of research on mindfulness now. And actually, I downloaded the Headspace app because I was talking to a lot of officers about burnout and how they should engage in mindfulness and in the kind of empirical validity of it and things like that. But like, I didn't necessarily know what mindfulness was. And I have ADD. My brain is going like this all the time. And so it was really, really hard to sit down for 10 minutes and like focus on my breathing and stuff like that. Within like 3 months though, dramatic changes. Like I felt like I was like less aggressive in traffic and things like that. And so um like our how are agencies incorporating mindfulness into this work? And so one of the key things that investigators told us that helps is taking breaks frequently throughout work. And so maybe some of those breaks should be like a mindfulness break where they need to do the 10 minutes from Headspace, go for a walk. Some commanders were telling us like they don't want their officers looking at CSAM material 2 hours before they go home, so that like it's and so taking the breaks, allowing time to take breaks. And the other thing I think is really important is sending investigators to good trainings that are not webinars, like that are getting them to go. So like we have we had the conference on crimes against children here. It was always in Dallas, and now they have their own. They still have it, but now there's a whole internet crimes against children conference kind of thing. And like it's those like same thing with academics. Like we love to go to these boring research conferences because like that's really exciting and we get new ideas and we are being able to socialize with people who do this work and can understand the stressors. And plus it's fun to, be able to learn new things in like New Orleans or a different area. But like these are the individuals that we really should be investing in and keeping them healthy and sending them to the advanced trainings. And I understand that that's all officers do is training, 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 training. But like the specialized trainings in these, whether that's a Cellbrite training or something like that, like get them out of the office and into a learning environment. Other things too is like how are we supporting officers in terms of financial wellness? Do agencies like a lot of agencies promote here like, hey, we'll pay for you to go to college and things like that. Like what are the this goes back to the health oriented leadership. It is focusing on putting supervisors and administrators in these positions that care about the well-being of their employees and by advocating for things that show the employees that they care. There's one study that looked at work family policies, and what was interesting is that a lot of the people didn't actually use the policies, but they liked that they existed because it sent a message from the administrators that they care about them. And so like how often are administrators conveying like, hey, make sure you take time for yourself, or hey, on every Friday now we're gonna wear jeans and then blow bubbles off the building. Like that sounds dumb, but it's something like that takes their mind out of it, and it shows that the agency is caring and recognizes that this information is really really hard.
What's your views on the stigma within policing around mental health? Because I know certainly here in the UK there is an awful lot of research which identifies that within police forces there is a large amount of stigma relating to it. Officers are worried about seeking help for mental health issues because they're worried it comes back later on and it prevents them from being promoted or moving to another job. Is that the case in the States?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it still is. And so what's awesome is we are getting a lot of great research coming out about women in policing and women in specialized units. And these are all interviews that happened within the past 5 years, and it's still a very masculine environment, like especially like women getting into SWAT, where so granted it's a lot better than it was, and you do have a lot of officers that recognize the value of vulnerability and diversity and things like that. But even the women that are going in, it's still like they're being challenged, they're being tested to see whether or not they can cut it, kind of thing. And so, granted, that may be more of a specialized unit, but I think the more that we are normalizing health and wellness in officers. I'm sure they're so tired because officers are so tired of hearing like a self-care plan and things like that. And so it's just, but like, are we doing trainings and workshops to help them develop a self-care plan? And so I think a lot of it is like we need to be putting we need to be identifying people who are formal and informal leaders within the agency. So maybe someone on patrol that is, not a supervisor in any capacity, but has influence over others. Like, how can we kind of identify some of these influential individuals within an agency, pull them for training, and then train them on secondary traumatic stress, burnout, how to peer-to-peer coaching and things like that. And so when they go back to their own units, they have influence, and so they can kind of normalize the importance of doing this. And um, encouraging them to use to demonstrate and model self-care as well. So like in the United States, a lot of agencies are going towards allowing officers to be able to work out on shift and so get paid to work out. And so I would like to see that being extended to civilians as well, and especially digital forensic examiners who may not be sworn, to also have that opportunity to take a break and go work out, to go engage in mindfulness, to go talk to. So I up in Fort Collins, Colorado, they have had an in-house psychologist, or he's a psychiatrist for 30 years. He just retired. But everyone in that agency, they're like, "Oh, I want to go talk to Dr. Dan." Like talking like that is the normal aspect of it, and it's because they have a lot of leadership that are really focused on, health and well-being, because policing is all, a lot of the issues in terms of masculinity is like you have to be tough and blah 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 and stuff like that. But being tough is also being mentally tough as well, and being able to know when you are starting to experience these, and being open to hearing others feedback about, hey, I've noticed like this is going on and things like that, and so emphasizing the importance of that.
You just talked there about the psychologist, sorry, the psychiatrist who had been in that role for 30 years. How important do you think the continuity of talking to the same person about mental health issues is, and does that make it easier for someone who is suffering mental health issues to really open up to someone?
Yes, I would think so. Is one, because he has that institutional knowledge, and a couple other things too. He has two offices. He has one in the police department, and then he has one that is not connected to any public building or anything like that. And so officers don't necessarily have to be seen going to see him and things like that. But the fact that he is a police psychologist, that's like his background and things like that. Like he has that unique institutional knowledge that I feel like if officers aren't opening up, he can ask questions in ways that can help them maybe potentially talk about some of the things that they are dealing with, because he's heard it from these officers, and he's heard everything about how this work impacts them personally outside of work and things like that. And so I think that's really helpful. Plus, he is not a police officer, but like he can kind of understand the unique stressors and traumas that are part of this. And this is why I feel like, especially for like rural agencies where we're starting to see a lot more of the telehealth, and here's a hotline so you can connect to a therapist like wherever and things like that. It kind of goes back to this idea of like, if you're 25 years in policing, and then you go to like a counselor, and it's like a 23-year-old that just graduated with their social work degree and has never really worked in policing, and you're trying to talk about like indirect traumas from child sexual abuse materials, like that may not be within their wheelhouse. And in office, and people who are in crisis and trauma, I've done it with therapists too, you pick up real quick like, this person doesn't know what I'm talking about or doesn't get what I'm talking about and may not. But at the same time, so that's another thing too. It's like we need to get more. I would love to see more officers as social workers, that where agencies are paying for them to go get their degrees in counseling and social work, so that we have more people that recognize the stressors of policing, who are equipped to provide clinical support. And so they may not be police officers anymore, but they work in these agencies as um, counselors and social workers to help officers.
Someone with lived experience, but who is
Yes, I think
also
that's so important.
qualified to deliver support.
And this is not to say that people that don't have the lived experience of policing are not qualified to support. I'm talking specifically about, there is a we there child sexual abuse material is a different type of trauma than other types of trauma that can occur in policing. And so it's helpful to have people that are very aware of that. And like also I would question how many trauma programs are really focusing on the indirect aspects of it. Because I think so many times we are dealing with clients that like they are victims of crime, they've been in a horrific, they have the PTSD versus like someone that is, no, I've never been directly exposed, but every day I have to hear the sounds of these children and things like that. Like do how can we train people to specialize in that? And then last, I think what's also important is I feel like every station should have a station dog, which is like a support dog that just hangs out and go and walks around.
A therapy
We
dog.
in yeah, well, not even a therapy dog, but just more of like a support dog. So it's a trained dog. It's not just like just a lab running around doing nothing, but yeah, I guess a therapy or a support. I know that there are differences. I'm not entirely sure, but we're starting to see a lot more agencies get small grants to have a dog in a dog in the station to help, and so they especially in the dispatch area are emergency 911 callers. And then what's also interesting, I just read a study and it was an experimental design to see whether having a dog in a child forensic interview helps reduce stress. And so they took cortisol samples of children before and after, and those that did and did not have the dog, and they found that stress levels were dramatically decreased when they were able to be in there petting a dog, things like that. And so I feel like that would be really important for officers as well. Like I need to go see, the psychiatrist, but if he had a dog there and I can pet while I'm doing it as well, like that might be more encouraging or helpful for that officer to open up.
It's very interesting you say that, because I now work as a psychologist within the NHS here in England. And one of the things I've just finished is a therapy dog evaluation with patients within the facility where I work. And the outcomes from that, the early outcomes from that, because I haven't finished analysing all the data, but they are incredibly positive,
That's
incredibly
awesome.
so. The
I love
difference
to
it
hear
makes,
that.
the difference it makes is really, really significant. How do you think your research can influence policing on the type of support that they provide?
I think it provides more credence to the normalization of the importance of taking care of ourselves and our families. I think the message is something that officers can resonate with, and sometimes it's like, yeah, it makes sense on face value that this information and this material would be hard, but actually to show them data. And I always like to do the mixed method studies where you have the numbers, but then you also have the quotes to help support it. And I can send you the slides that I do in my burnout training that has some of the quotes from other studies that we've done that really
That
kind
would be
of
useful.
that speak to individuals and their experiences. And so that was something that I thought was really interesting, was that like I was interested in this topic. And when I started doing these trainings, it's like you kind of see a light bulb and like, they're like, that's what it is. Or like, that's okay. So this is a thing. It's actually, so I think this research and the research that you're doing and others are doing in this area are really, really important because it, I mean, it's empirical science to help kind of the administrative naysayers who like think it's a kid in a bathtub or are not concerned about all that, like to show that like, hey, this is an occupational hazard. You as an employer have an obligation to keep your employees safe and
Yes, they
to
do.
the extent possible. And so this is a risk factor for severe mental health issues and burnout. And so we already have an issue with recruitment and retention in policing. And so if we are not investing in our investigators and our officers who are working these cases, we are just going to have burned out officers. Because that's the thing too. They'll serve in this unit for 5 years, rotate out, but trauma could be the body keeps score, right? So like
Yeah.
everything that happened to them in that, like now that travels with them to the next unit and it doesn't fix things outside of work. And so if we are not investing in preventative aspects from onboarding to not only onboarding, but also what are we doing when officers retire? This is very similar to officers getting out of the military, where so much of their life was identified within the military. And so same with policing. And so when you're doing this work, like I quickly had to realize that, like, when I started working with the sex offenders, I'd be like, oh my God, this crazy thing happened. And then I start talking about it and I just see the faces in others where they're like, I'm like, oh, turns out not everyone wants to talk about child abuse at the Chili's. So, and like, I had to quickly realize there's a time and a place, and not everyone is thrilled about this. And so when that is so much of your life and so what you know, and then all of
It
a sudden
becomes
you're
normalized,
retired.
doesn't it?
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you're done, you're retired, you're things like that, and you just have all those thoughts, and it's a big transition. So what are agencies doing to help people when they are retiring and developing support systems even after? Because it can be very lonely after policing, especially when you're not surrounded by a lot of other officers.
But the other thing is, are agencies supplying that mechanism where they kind of wind the officers down, decompress them, and give them the coping strategies they need to continue? I don't think they
See, it's
are.
hard. I don't no, not to the extent that they need to be. I'm comfortable saying that because like I definitely have seen good examples of agencies doing well, but that's not the majority of agencies because as you
No,
know, policing is a government agency, resources are only so, you know,
they're quite finite, aren't
resources
they? Yeah,
are limited. And the other issue too is like with staffing issues and especially officers that have the investigative skills to do this work, it's hard. So even if you had programs to help, officers kind of wind down before they go home for work, some, that 2 hours, like there may be so many cases that the officers are like, I can't engage in this right now because I have so many cases and it's overwhelming, or it's hard. And so I honestly feel like it's going to take a whole kind of culture change within policing,
I
which
agree.
I'm very optimistic about, and especially younger officers now, because the people that are going to policing now are the most educated that they've ever been, and so they very are attuned. But it's also Gen Z and below, it's all the anxious generation. So these are individuals that are already coming into policing, addicted to screens, have overprotective parents and things like that, and so they already have these anxious kind of depression aspects of it. And so, and then they get into policing and this stuff. So even though they're educated and they understand the importance of well-being and stuff like that, how are we ensuring that people are taking care of themselves without violating personal privacy and things like that? So I'm optimistic about it, but I would like to see a lot more. But I think that goes in. But I'm an academic who sits in an ivory tower, being like, it would be great if they had a therapy dog, right? It's easier said than done, and so
It
that's why
is
I love
much
talking
easier
to.
said than done.
Yeah, I love talking to people in the field because it's like they're the ones boots on the ground that recognize what would and would not work. And so that's why I don't feel like academics can solve this alone. We have to develop these researcher practitioner partnerships that are about trust and mutual goals and figuring out how do we reduce suicides, how do we improve the well-being of officers so that we can have people that are competent doing this, but that they also deserve the life outside of work that they deserve, which is a healthy family with friends and enjoy life.
What specific changes would you recommend for law enforcement to support digital forensic investigators?
That's a good question. I think one, because I'm a researcher, I think definitely more government support for research with digital forensic investigators, and agencies being willing enough to work with researchers to help figure out what works so that we can develop not necessarily a blanket policy or program, but something that other agencies can adopt and adapt to help their officers as well. I definitely think more funding for trainings outside of the office, and out of the state potentially. So like more the specialized trainings where they could go and mingle with other forensic investigators for a weekend and learn some new skills and bring that back. I think we need to do. Uh, I think promotion needs to have a health oriented leadership component of it. And so, like a lot of times, I mean, in the promotions, they ask about their leadership style and their strategy. So I've done those too in terms of the promotion, and that's something I always put in there. I'm like, this is the only candidate that even mentioned anything about mental health or health of the officers or things like that. And I was like, these other were focused so much more on physical health um, versus the mental health. And so I feel like we need to have more supervisors that are well rounded in not only understanding leadership, but how do you be a leader among individuals who are likely to be in crisis and or easily triggered by some of the information because of the nature of the content. And then what does that look like in their agency? And then how can we help those supervisors learn from other supervisors? And so definitely more support. And then my last recommendation would be more support for family and friends of people who do this work, to the point that they don't necessarily have to know everything that they're exposed to, but um, to the point where they know that it is traumatic information that is likely potentially can change their personality behaviors. And so, what can we do to be a supportive person in that role? I also looked at real quick one thing with the police chiefs. We collected data with police chiefs and we asked them if they were in a relationship and whether they were in a relationship with another police officer, someone that worked in the field of criminal justice, or someone that didn't deal with this like at all. And I wanted to see if that impacted stress and burnout, and it didn't. What impacted stress and burnout was being single.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought like, but granted, this is police chiefs, and so it's already lonely at the top, and I couldn't imagine. I mean, dating is hard enough, but dating as a police chief in a small town would probably be even more rough. But I mean, it's the same for officers, where it's like, we need human interaction, we need support from others, and what I got from that is like it didn't necessarily matter about whether they fully knew what was going on, but like they were a partner that could provide different types of emotional social support and helping them feel more human in a world that doesn't always feel human.
Do you think there's adequate resources assigned to supporting DFIs?
No, personally, no, I don't think so. And that's hard, right? Because the bulk of a police department's budget is personnel, right? And so everything on top of that is really trying to figure it out. And so I think that it speaks more to the government's role in providing that funding, like especially like not even necessarily like research grants, but grants for agencies to develop a wellness program. Like let's try different things out. And we're seeing that now. Like every RFP that comes out for federal funding now has like some officer safety and wellness aspect of it, which I think is great. I want to see more of it, and I want to see more efforts to help grant writers and people within agencies to write these grants so that they can get it, because writing grants is insane and it takes a lot of time. And then it's like, and officers aren't always grant managers and things like that. So like I just think if society is concerned about turnover in policing, we need to start investigating, or not investigating, we need to start investing in streamlining trauma within agencies and focusing on the units where trauma is most likely to be present, and that's going to be your elder abuse, your vulnerable victim unit. And it's not picking favorites, but like providing additional resources to those units so they have the adequate software, they have the adequate technology, they have the training, but they also have the support both inside work and outside of work.
I think one final question, because I have taken up quite a bit of your time
Like I
today.
said, I'm on break. I don't even go back to work until 2 weeks. So like I said, I could talk to you for hours, but we have to
What further research do you feel is needed in this area?
definitely perceptions of family members, but also longitudinal research. We need to measure these factors from the same individuals over time and really isolate the things that they're doing that reduce it and increase that stress. And so that goes back to a recommendation about increased funding for research with these agencies. But what's interesting is that I've been very lucky. I really have not come across a supervisor or commander that like doesn't agree with the need for research. And so it's nice that a lot of these agencies are becoming more willing to work with researchers in those areas. But definitely the longitudinal aspects of it. I would love to do a lot more focus groups with people that do the work to kind of address social support and what that is and what that looks like and what they want.
And how they
Because
can
I think
use that?
absolutely, and what are the strategies to implement that? And also, like, I would love to interview people who score very low on burnout and secondary traumatic stress to see what are they doing that might be unique, and or what would they, because I always love to ask officers, like, whatever I'm studying, um, what would you tell yourself, when you first started about this? And so usually it's like stress and burnout. Like, what would you have told yourself when you were getting into this unit to help kind of cope with the reality? Knowing what you know now, what would you have liked to tell yourself? And that to me is like, how would you help onboard future officers and getting into this role kind of thing? Because I don't want officers to scare others away, because some officers were like straight up like, I don't want anything to do with the crimes against children. I fully understand that. But the ones that are interested in doing it, hopefully for the right reasons, like let's build them and get them the experience and the training, but also the reality to understanding that like this is not a walk in the park. Like this is intense. And so definitely more research to understand the social support, more research on perceptions outside of it. I would even love to do a survey of just administrators of agencies that have a child abuse unit or a ICAC unit to see, do they even know what they do, so that
Yes.
like I can
What's
show other
their
administrators
understanding
is
of
like,
what's going on at the coalface?
yes, because I feel like that is the kind of research that's really going to be enlightening for other administrators, because other administrators, they may be the person that are like, well, I thought I knew what they did kind of thing. Or like, how often are they checking in? Do they even know they're digital forensic investigators and things like that? And so, and granted, it's not, their job to be their counselor, but it's even like stopping by, like showing face, like, helping them recognize that they are valued and supported within this agency. Like, those are the leaders that we want. But I don't think the majority of administrators would know the nature and extent of the work that y'all do. And that's no shade on them. They have a lot of meetings. They're busy. My recommendation to all police officers is to never become a police chief. That sounds awful, but like again, those are also necessary positions, kind of thing. But yeah, so just more research in general, and I, it's hard. I would love to figure out a way that we can help officers who are struggling with suicide ideology that doesn't require them to like relinquish their weapon. And I know that's easier said than done, and that's not really my wheelhouse in terms of the ethical aspects of all of that. But I think the more that we implement leaders who care about the wellness of their employees, the more that we're going to change cultures within agencies. Because that's the thing, across the board, across the world, every single agency has their own unique culture that is so different than the town over. And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
it's one of those things where you have to be realistic, and that I'm good with like one agency at a time. One agency changing something to improve the lives of the officers that are working for those agencies, and hopefully that information spreads throughout the state, throughout the world, and things like that. And so it's and making research more um digestible to people in the field. That
Make it
like,
in plain language as opposed to complicated language that people
yes.
don't want to read.
Yeah, and easy, like a 1 to 2 page handout, like for administrators, because everyone's busy. We want a summary kind of thing. And now that we have like AI and different things like that, there's so many ways that we can really make information digestible to officers. I think roll call trainings would be really helpful as well. Every now and then, just reminding officers, like, hey, these are the two components of burnout. These are the symptoms. Like, here are some things to look at. That could be a 5 minute video. It could be a corny animation, but it would be something that helps officers remind them. And the other thing too is like officers are interested in this. Like even though they don't necessarily think about stress management, like some officers are really healthy. They like to work out, and others, but like every person who's probably held a badge and a gun recognizes the dangers and the stress that can come from this job. And so I would imagine that they're all open to solutions and suggestions that seem realistic and feasible to actually help them cope with this job.
It's actually quite interesting. One of the things I just mentioned again there was the training within the sort of roll call time when cops are coming onto shift. One of the things I've done here in the UK is create a booklet which explains what the signs and symptoms are that DFIs may become susceptible to, what they look like, how they affect you, and how you can deal with them. And I've
Yeah,
distributed that to various forces and companies within the UK, and the feedback I've got from that has been really positive because,
it's
as
awesome.
you as you quite rightly identified, many people don't know how to put a label on it or what to do. So
Yeah.
and I found that quite cathartic doing it. I'll be honest.
Good. And because it's hard. And like that's the other thing, is finding correct information, because still at this point in 2025, we still don't have consistent definitions on what secondary traumatic stress is,
No.
compassion fatigue, all that stuff, and that drives me nuts. Even though I try to outline it in that article, being like there are succinct things, but like I said, the other thing too is like I've been burnout before, and it's very scary because it's like you feel like your life's over. You're like, oh, I don't know how I can do this work. Specifically from doing this research, it
Mhm.
really can get to you. And then you go on vacation, you come back, and then you're still exhausted. It's like so it's burnout is a lot harder than we to deal with than we think, but that's why I feel like we need to be a lot more proactive to getting people to helping everyone else in the agency look out for one another and recognize, like, so if you have an officer that you think is crappy at their job or irritable, things like that, like these are all indicators of some potentially type of stress that's going on. So like, do we have supervisors that can hold them accountable but still in a respectful way that like encourages them to take care of themselves, go see the therapist or something like that.
But do we have the supervisors who are qualified enough to recognise those signs and symptoms, and then direct that person to the help that they need?
And do others respect and support that person that gets the supervisor role, because the distributive justice is another predictor of turnover in policing. And so if officers feel promotion is big among officers, and a lot of the consistent complaints across police departments is they feel like supervisors play favorites, the people that get into these roles are the friends of others, and so there's not like a due process or easy way to do that kind of thing like that. And so I feel like there's like better criteria, especially being like this person scored 10 out of 10 on the health and wellness kind of thing. Like this, even though you don't like them, this is the kind of person that like cares about the unit and be in that way kind of thing. So I don't know. It's easier said than done. That's why I like being an academic, being like, thanks for having me on your podcast. Please do all the things I said.
Before we stop the recording, I've noticed that you have recently been doing an awful lot of research around stalking.
Yes, yes.
I would love to do this again, but target it at the research that you've been doing around stalking, because that is a very big, very hot topic over here right now.
Don't you threaten me with a good time, because that's another topic that I love to talk about. And that's another thing that I've realized too is that I've done so many trainings where the officers come in to do like a stalking domestic violence training, and they're like, but at the end, it's like a line out the door. There's like, because it's just, we cannot be upset about officers doing something that they're not getting adequate training in. And so many officers don't get adequate training in stalking. But what's awesome is like the UK, England, Wales, Australia, you guys are 10 years ahead of the research in not only this, but also stalking domestic violence. And so I'm learning so much from y'all doing that. But yes, I would love to talk to you about that in terms of the investigative standpoint, why victims contact the police, why they participate in the cases, what the offenders or what the motives of offenders are, and how we can really identify stalking cases and helping officers kind of put the pieces together. But that's for another time and
I'll
place.
arrange that. I'll come back to you and
Perfect.
I'll arrange that for another time. Professor, I want to say how grateful I am for the time that you've given me today. I'm sure the viewers in Forensic Focus will really appreciate the advice, the guidance, the knowledge that you've shared. Um, Thank you very much.
Of course. And then if any of your listeners want access to the articles, things like that, I have no problem. They can contact me. I can give you my information and things like that. I have no problem sending that to them, because sometimes they're behind paywalls. And that's another frustrating thing about making research digestible and accessible to the people that need it the most.
I'll make sure the readers are aware of that.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.